Welcome to the Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com, hosted by Mark Angelides.
There are symbols and signs, some open, some coded, that push us towards one thing or away from another. The most overlooked of these is that of colour. We may not realise it, but the natural world and the political world are full of secret messages based on colour and hue that are not only guiding us, but purposefully so. And those who understand the special properties of colour can use them to their own political ends for their charged games and intrigues. From our advertisements to our social media use, by way of a carefully presented thematic episode, we're under a barrage of information, and that information is crafted to persuade. Have you ever wondered why the likes of Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Tumblr, Periscope, and so many others all have blue as their main colour, their themed colour? Blue represents something, in this case communication and calm. Blue's known as a background colour, and it doesn't get in your face, and therefore it promotes calmness and gives users a sense of peace when they're involved in it. The user feels that they're somewhere that they should be. And it also helps that blue is the colour that's most favoured by both men and women. Blue is also the colour that during the Shu dynasty in ancient China was the required clothing colour of all of the regular folks, the civilian classes, blue or black, with other brighter colours being reserved for high-ranking officials, and of course the emperor being the only person allowed to wear yellow. So blue became almost a badge of working class roots. Mandarins would often just wear a hint of blue in their dress, whether that's a feather or a gem, to show that they have not lost touch with the working classes, those they rule over. It showed that they were one of the people, which is very handy in a country that's got a very long history of revolution and uprising. And what of the present political system? We associate blue with Democrats and red with Republicans. Blue's an emotive colour because of the associations that we have with it. So when politicians talk about a blue wave, they mean a powerful force of nature, but also one that will result eventually in an ocean of calm. Blue sky thinking gives us an idea of an unconscious connection that attempts to persuade us that Democrats are the party of the grand idea, never before tried, except of course that it has. To uncover the roots of the American political colours, it's important to look at the past and the history and the precursors, in this case the British parliamentary system. In the United Kingdom, blue is the colour of the Conservative Party, and in fact it's the colour used by many right-leaning political outfits around the world. Conservatives or Tories were more or less forced into this colour choice by one event. Originally, the party, formed in 1834, used the full colour spectrum of the Union flag, or the Union Jack if it's at sea, red, white and blue. And then along came the Labour Party, the British equivalent of the Democrats. When this party of socialists and trade unionists began campaigning under the red flag, of which more later, the Tories were forced to drop their colour from their banners to avoid confusion. Being left with just blue and white, they opted to go for blue. But back to America for a moment. Why do parties that have ideological brothers and sisters across the pond not have the same colours? Well, essentially this is because the Republicans and the Democrats didn't choose their own colours. In fact, this standardization that we know today didn't really come into place until the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. Prior to this, all newspapers and news networks would vary which colour represented on an outlet-by-outlet basis. And then came the New York Times and the USA Today electoral maps, which gave red to the Republicans, apparently because it started with an R. Whether this is an honest designation or not is lost to history, but if one were more sceptical, a case could be made that it was an intentional switch from the British traditions. Since Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956, the New York Times has never supported a Republican presidential candidate, although they have on occasion supported individual Republicans for other offices. From 1960 onwards, they always battled for the Democrat. When deciding what colour to use in the widely viewed electoral maps of 2000, would it be beyond the publishers to try and make a little political capital? Portraying the Democrats as blue gives them an aura of calm and contemplation, and as mentioned, it appeals to both men and women. But it also means they're not identified with the colour red, which could perhaps be of more significance. Traditionally, red represented the monarchy or the church, quite literally the blood of Christ. During the French Revolution of 1789, the red flag was adopted to represent not the blood of Christ, but the blood of the angry workers. And this use of the red flag continued through the Russian Revolution, Marxism, socialism, and generally every left-leaning political organization. We see it in communist China and the hammer and sickle. It's no secret that much of America had anti-communist tendencies, and the connection between communism, socialism, and the Democratic Party is clear to see. Even today, with the likes of Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the former Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders, all espousing a rehashed version of this ideology under the banner of Democratic Socialist. The red flag, the Marxist roots, and the Dems, it's an interlocking history that gives many Americans an uncomfortable feeling. The political satirist, author and journalist P.J. O'Rourke perhaps described this deep-seated feeling best in a radio interview he gave in 2010. Quote, "I go off to college, and actually I'd become a communist to meet girls. So I came home at Christmas with my hair down to my shoulders and a jean jacket with a big red fist on the back, saying, arise ye proletariat or whatever. And my grandmother looks at me and says, 'Pat, I'm worried about you. Are you becoming a Democrat?' I said, 'Democrat? Grandma, of course I'm not a Democrat. I'm a communist.' And my grandmother paused, and she said, 'Well, as long as you're not a Democrat.'" End quote. So we have the communist red and the stable blue, and each is displayed to make associations. It's almost a freebie in terms of political messaging that allows people to live within their own echo chambers without ever having to hear a dissenting view. Colours are beautiful things. They can inspire emotions, calm an angered heart, soothe a savage soul, and even provide the boost of passion that we so often need to help us overcome the challenges of life. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the colour of its thoughts." Was this perhaps a warning? Are we too easily swayed by the secret language of colour and therefore opening ourselves up to danger for our very being? Forewarned is forearmed. Never assume that a picture is just a picture, or that a colour is just a colour, or even that a kiss is just a kiss. These are the fundamental things that apply.
Welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics in Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com, hosted by Mark Angelides.
As discussed in the last edition of The Rabbit Hole, colour is more than just a reflection of light. It's a political tool used to persuade, to encourage, and lead the masses to commit to decisions they may not otherwise take. We examined how the Democratic and Republican parties got their colours, and how the politicization of blue and red comes with connotations that spur us to action. But there's a whole rainbow to choose from when dissecting the colours of politics. In this edition, I want to look back in time at how colour has been used as a signal in both war and leadership, and how many of these indicators still exist for us today in the present. The most obvious use of colour to determine one's affiliation is that of military wear. When we think about battles raged across an open plain, we often envisage uniforms worn by the combatants, all marching in line in one united force. But this is not quite true. In fact, the idea of a codified uniform is not really something that came about fully, as in it was something the average civilian might recognize as a unifying outfit, until the mid-1600s with Oliver Cromwell. Before this, there was actually a lot of variety in the clothing and colours, and of course in what those colours meant. In the 7th or 8th century BC, in ancient Greece, there were the infamous Spartan hoplites. The name hoplite was translated as equipment because each soldier would have similar equipment, but later translations suggest it means infantry. These hoplites were made up of the middle classes of the various Greek city-states, the middle classes being the only ones who could afford the required equipment. But in Sparta, almost all military-age men were hoplites. Two aspects define these soldiers, the first being the fighting formation they used, that of the phalanx. It's a devastating approach that ensured all men were acting as one unit. The second being the gear, the weapons they carried. Each soldier would take a spear, a shield, and a sword, and they would, if they could afford it, wear a form of body armor too. Yet these weapons were not standardized. They were more often than not handed down from father to son. The concave shields they carried were called aspis, and they were more often than not decorated with a family or a clan emblem to show who they bore allegiance to. So what was it that separated them from the opposing army? Many sources suggest that these Spartan warriors would wear a red tunic or a red cape, or both. Now, the cape was likely removed before battle as it could hinder movement or be an easy target to be grabbed from behind. But there are some interesting facts about why they would don red. Firstly, red was the color of Ares, the god of war. By having his color present on the battlefield, they were honoring him and asking for favor in the outcome. Ares' food was the blood of men, and he was often predicted as having a shield full of gore. And of course, his planet was Mars, the red planet even today. The second reason the Spartans chose to wear red gives us a real insight into how sophisticated these supposedly noble savages really were. It was psychological warfare. You see, the Spartans knew full well that having their opponents fear them was a devastating advantage. It's a reputation that they sought to foster, that they were warriors who couldn't be defeated in battle. It pushed their enemies to act defensively and to be cautious. If the Spartans were injured in battle, it covered any spilling of the blood, making them seem invincible, and of course not making them appear the easier target. We can see this use of red in later military endeavors also. The New Model Army formed in 1645 and most closely associated with Oliver Cromwell, although he himself had to resign his post with the new self-denying laws. These soldiers were kitted out with red coats. There doesn't appear to be a symbolic meaning behind this choice, rather that the material was sourced from the lowest bidder. But the idea of red military men stuck and became the color of choice for centuries later. In fact, it wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that bright colors were phased out for soldiers in combat situations. There are all too often practical reasons for the choice of color. In the United Kingdom, soldiers today wear an olive green khaki because it's historically the best color for camouflage, essentially not making the individual an identifiable target against a backdrop. But of course, many of the major theaters of war nowadays are in the Middle East, and as such, overseas servicemen will wear a light tan uniform. Napoleonic soldiers wore a distinctive white uniform, very bright, with a colored overcoat. Now, why they did this exactly is a somewhat contested issue. One side presents the argument that Napoleon, who certainly understood flair and style, being a leader who spent ample time designing his own uniforms, likely wanted his troops to look pristine at all times. While the other armies would be wearing any old clothes they had, he wanted his men to stand out and never looked fatigued or broken. And then there's the other school of thought, which says that due to the British naval blockade, France was unable to get the dyes that they needed. The reality is probably a mix of both. We've discussed soldiers and their uniforms, but what of wars? And more importantly, what of revolutions? Starting with the Yellow Revolution, or the People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986, these color revolutions have been a staple of the last 35 years. The Yellow Revolution came about as a revolt against former President Ferdinand Marcos and, to a lesser extent, his infamous wife, Imelda Marcos. But why was it yellow? Well, the protesters would wear a yellow ribbon as a nod to the song Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree by Tony Orlando. The spark of this revolution was the assassination of Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., who, after 3 years of self-imposed exile, had returned home. He was murdered on the tarmac right after landing. And as the song explains, "It's been 3 long years, do you still want me?" And let's not forget what's happening in France right now. Although pretty much all media coverage has stopped, every weekend thousands of yellow vest protesters shut down the streets of Paris and engage in quarrels with the military-style police, the gendarmerie. Fires, tear gas, injuries, and still the occasional death. But of course, Emmanuel Macron is a darling of the left-leaning media and committed globalist. Therefore, it goes against the agenda to show the world that a revolution is taking place in one of the world's most important economies. We're allegedly in the information age, but it seems the information is only to go one way. The media, governments, and supranational organizations, they understand the power of colors. They seek to use the inherent connotations for their own ends while hiding the events unfolding today, all over the world. Colors are powerful things, and unless we understand their importance and their significance, it will never be the actual real people who wield that power.
Go deeper on the topic discussed in this video. Head on over to one of these links here or go to our Liberty Nation Roku channel. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for Liberty.
The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production.
Available at Libsyn, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, on Roku, and other fine podcast providers.